The heart monitor's staccato beeping sliced through the operating room's sterile silence. Dr. Harrison's gloved hands froze mid-air, blood draining from his face beneath his surgical mask. Under the harsh lights, the open cavity on Robert Walker's back revealed what no medical textbook had prepared him for. "Sweet Jesus," the nurse whispered, stepping back. It wasn't a tumor. It wasn't any medical anomaly he'd encountered in 30 years of practice. Instead, a dark mass pulsated through muscle tissue like gnarled roots of some ancient parasitic tree, clinging to human flesh with tendrils that disappeared into vital organs. Then came the smell, not the clean metallic scent of blood, but a sharp chemical tang that brought Dr. Harrison back to another place, another time. "Agent Orange?" he murmured, meeting the scrub nurse's confused gaze. "This isn't just cancer." We're fighting history itself. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Robert Walker woke every morning at precisely 5:45 a.m. No alarm needed. Military precision had long ago seeped into his bones. 55 years after Vietnam, some habits were permanent as the scars he carried. First the coffee, black and bitter. Then the porch, where his rocking chair faced east across the Mississippi woods. Always alone. The cabin he'd built with his own hands in '71 stood as both sanctuary and prison, every nail hammered with purpose. Inside, framed photographs gathered dust, his Air Force unit, 6 men standing knee-deep in jungle mud. One face scratched out. Robert never explained why, and no one remained to ask. Locals called him Quiet Bob. Polite but distant, a ghost among the living. They knew he'd served, but not that he'd flown the missions no one talked about. Crop dusters modified to rain down chemicals with names like Agent Orange across the Vietnamese countryside. Some nights, he still smelled it in his dreams. Emily called every Sunday at 7 p.m. sharp. Their conversations were brief, perfunctory. "How's your health, Dad?" "Fine." "Taking your meds?" "Yep." "Need anything?" "I'm good." What Emily didn't know, what Robert had spent 45 years ensuring she never discovered, was that she wasn't his biological daughter. The truth lay buried in a metal box beneath the cabin's floorboards. Papers from a Saigon orphanage, a faded photograph of a destroyed village, and a letter he'd written but never sent explaining why he'd brought home a Vietnamese infant after his 3rd tour, passing her off as his own when his wife Margaret was too drunk to question the child's features. Margaret had embraced motherhood as her salvation, sobering up and loving Emily fiercely until cancer took her 17 years ago. The secret became easier to keep with Margaret gone. Emily had her own life now, a successful physical therapist in Memphis with 2 kids who rarely visited their difficult grandfather. The metal taste had started last winter. Robert recognized it instantly, the same acrid flavor that lingered after missions when chemical mist drifted through cockpit seals. He ignored it, as he'd ignored the occasional tremors in his hands, the night sweats, the patches of skin that sometimes felt numb. But the pimples, or whatever they were, those became harder to dismiss. First 1, then 3, then 7, dark purple-black protrusions across his back, clustered like angry constellations. He tried everything, antibiotic cream, hot compresses, even pouring whiskey over them one desperate night. Nothing worked. They didn't hurt, exactly. That somehow made it worse. In his darkest moments, alone in the cabin as spring rain drummed against the tin roof, Robert wondered if this was punishment. Divine justice for the villages he'd helped destroy, for the lies he'd constructed to give himself the family he craved but didn't deserve. Robert's daily routine had become a battlefield. Simple tasks, like pulling on a shirt, sent jagged pain across his shoulders where the strange growths had spread. By April, he counted 12 distinct masses, some now larger than quarters, their surfaces shiny and taut like overripe fruit ready to burst. "Just old age," he muttered to his reflection one morning, twisting awkwardly to examine his back in the bathroom mirror. The lie tasted as metallic as the strange flavor that now permanently coated his tongue. That evening, while splitting logs for his wood stove, a ritual that had kept him strong well into his 60s, the world suddenly tilted sideways. The axe slipped from his grasp as vertigo sent him stumbling. When his vision cleared, Robert found himself on his knees, hands buried in damp earth, gasping like a drowning man. For the first time in decades, genuine fear gripped him. Not the ambient anxiety that had been his constant companion since the war, but primal terror. Something was profoundly wrong. Inside, his hands trembled as he retrieved the ancient flip phone he kept charged for emergencies. His thumb hovered over Emily's contact longer than it should have. Pride and shame waged their familiar war. He'd spent a lifetime handling his own problems. But as another wave of dizziness washed over him, self-preservation won. When Emily's voice answered, bright and distracted, he almost hung up. "Dad, everything okay?" "I think—" His voice cracked, betraying him. "I might need some help." The silence on the line spoke volumes. In 50 years, Robert Walker had never asked for help. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," Emily said, her tone shifting from surprise to professional efficiency. "Have you called Dr. Mercer?" "It's nothing that serious," he lied. "Just some spots on my back that won't heal." "Spots? What kind of spots?" The physical therapist in her took over. "Like pimples, I guess." "But bigger now." How inadequate the description felt. "How long?" "Few months." Another lie. The first had appeared nearly 6 months ago. Emily's sigh conveyed decades of frustration. "I'll be there by 10. Don't do anything stupid before then." That night, Robert dreamed of Vietnam. Not the usual nightmares of burning villages and screaming civilians, but of rain. Thick, oily droplets that clung to his skin and seeped into his pores. He woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat that smelled chemical and wrong. When Emily arrived precisely at 10 as promised, her practiced professional smile collapsed at the sight of him. Robert had always been lean and strong, a man who carried his age with stubborn dignity. The gaunt figure who greeted her barely resembled her father. "Jesus, Dad," she whispered. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let me see your back." In the kitchen's harsh light, Emily's sharp intake of breath told him everything. Her cool fingers traced the constellations of growths, now clustered primarily around his shoulder blades and spine. "These aren't pimples," she said, voice tight with controlled panic. "When was your last physical?" Robert shrugged. "Few years. Try 7. I checked with Dr. Mercer's office on the drive here." She stepped around to face him, arms crossed. "We're going to the hospital. Today. Now." "No hospitals." Robert shook his head firmly. "You know how I feel about— I don't give a damn how you feel about hospitals." Emily's voice cracked. "This isn't normal. These look infected, and they're—" She hesitated. "They're connected somehow. I can see patterns under your skin." Robert's shoulders slumped. He recognized the tone, Margaret's tone, the one that brooked no argument. "Veterans Affairs Clinic," he countered. "If I'm going anywhere—" Emily opened her mouth to argue, then nodded stiffly. "Fine, VA, but we're leaving in 10 minutes." The Memphis VA Medical Center hummed with the controlled chaos of understaffed efficiency. After 3 hours of waiting, forms, and preliminary examinations by a nurse who seemed barely old enough to drive, they were ushered into an examination room where Dr. James Harrison awaited. Unlike the young staff, Harrison carried the weathered look of a man who'd seen enough to know better. His salt and pepper beard was neatly trimmed, his white coat immaculate, but his eyes held shadows Robert recognized, the kind that came from seeing things most civilians couldn't comprehend. "Vietnam?" Dr. Harrison asked after a cursory introduction, noticing the faded tattoo on Robert's forearm. "Air Force, 68 to 70. Something flickered across the doctor's face. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. "3 tours, Robert added, unsure why he felt compelled to share this detail. "I was Army Medic 71, Harrison replied. "Just missed you." The examination that followed was thorough and increasingly disturbing. As Harrison's gloved hands explored the growths, his professional demeanor slipped, revealing genuine confusion that did nothing to ease Robert's growing dread. "Mr. Walker, were you ever near herbicide operations during your service?" The question came carefully, neutrally phrased. Robert's heart stuttered. In the corner, Emily looked up from her phone, brow furrowed. "Herbicide?" she echoed. "I need to order some tests," Harrison continued, ignoring her question. "Blood work, and I'd like to do an MRI of your back." "What kind of herbicide?" Emily pressed, now fully engaged. Harrison and Robert locked eyes in a moment of silent understanding between veterans. Robert gave an almost imperceptible nod. "During the Vietnam War," Harrison explained, turning to Emily, "the military used several defoliants to clear jungle vegetation. The most common was called Agent Orange." "I've heard of that," Emily said slowly, "but what does that have to do with my father's back?" Harrison removed his gloves with deliberate care. Agent Orange contained high levels of dioxin, an extremely toxic chemical. Veterans exposed have developed numerous health problems over the decades. Some unusual presentations. "I wasn't exposed," Robert interjected sharply. "I was a pilot, high altitude." Dr. Harrison's gaze remained steady. "Were you now? What exactly did you fly, Mr. Walker?" The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Robert felt the careful wall he'd built around his past beginning to crack. "UC-123 providers," he finally said, voice barely audible. "Modified crop dusters." Emily's sharp intake of breath cut through the silence. "You were a spray pilot." "You never told me that." "It was classified at the time," Robert replied, the lie tasting bitter. Everything had been classified, his convenient shield against questions for decades. "I'd like to do that MRI today," Harrison said, breaking the tension. "And if you're amenable, a small biopsy of one of these growths." "Will it help?" Robert asked, suddenly feeling every one of his 67 years. Harrison's expression softened slightly. "It might help a lot of people, Mr. Walker. You're not the first veteran I've seen with unusual presentations, but yours is particularly advanced." As they scheduled the procedures, Robert couldn't meet Emily's questioning gaze. The carefully constructed narrative of his war service, vague references to transport missions and supply runs, was unraveling. Soon he feared more than just that lie would be exposed. By evening, Robert lay face down on an MRI table, the machine's rhythmic pounding a counterpoint to his racing thoughts. Through the observation window, he glimpsed Emily in conversation with Dr. Harrison, her body language tense, animated. He closed his eyes, unable to watch as his past and present collided. The images would tell a story he'd spent 50 years trying to forget. Of missions flown low over triple-canopied jungle, of chemical mist trailing behind his aircraft like malevolent clouds, of returning to base with the same substance coating his skin despite sealed cockpits and oxygen masks. And soon, he feared, Emily would know everything. not just about Agent Orange, but about her own origins in a country her father had helped destroy. The MRI results arrived with devastating clarity. Dr. Harrison spread the films across the light board in his office, where Robert and Emily sat in stunned silence. The images revealed what looked like dark roots spreading beneath Robert's skin, tendrils of something foreign connecting each external growth, creating an intricate network throughout his upper back and shoulders. "I've never seen anything quite like this," Harrison admitted, tracing one particular branch with his finger. "The masses are interconnected subcutaneously, under the skin, forming what appears to be a unified system rather than individual cysts or tumors." Emily leaned forward, her medical training compelling her to look closer despite her personal horror. "What is it?" "That's what we need to determine through biopsy," Harrison replied. "But I have a theory." He turned to Robert, his expression grave. "You said you flew UC-123 providers, ranch hand operations?" Robert's jaw tightened. The code name unlocked memories he'd spent decades burying. Endless briefings about crop destruction, defoliation, denying enemy cover, never once mentioning villages, people, children. "Yes," he finally said. "Dad?" Emily's voice held a note of confusion. "What's ranch hand?" Robert couldn't meet her eyes. "It was the aerial spraying program. Agent Orange." The silence that followed felt physical, pressing against Robert's chest until he could barely breathe. In that moment, the first wall crumbled. The carefully maintained fiction that he'd been just another airman, far removed from the war's moral complexities. "You sprayed Agent Orange?" Emily finally asked, her voice unnaturally calm. "All those times you talked about flying transport missions?" "It was classified," Robert repeated his earlier excuse. "We weren't supposed to discuss operational details." "For 50 years? To your own family?" The hurt in Emily's eyes cut deeper than any physical pain he'd endured. "Doctor." Harrison cleared his throat. "The VA has documented numerous cases of various cancers, peripheral neuropathy, and other conditions linked to Agent Orange exposure. But this presentation," he gestured to the MRI films, "is unusual. The chemical composition of Agent Orange included TCDD-dioxin, one of the most toxic substances known. In most cases, it causes systemic damage over time, but doesn't create physical masses like these." "So what are you saying?" Emily demanded. "That my father is some kind of medical anomaly?" "I'm saying," Harrison replied carefully, "that your father may provide valuable insight into long-term dioxin effects that could help other veterans. With your permission," he addressed Robert directly, "I'd like to perform a biopsy today and consult with some colleagues at Walter Reed." Robert nodded numbly. The irony wasn't lost on him, that his body, which had once delivered poison, might now provide answers for those similarly poisoned. The biopsy procedure was scheduled for that afternoon. As a nurse prepared the local anesthetic, Robert found himself alone with Emily in the small examination room. The silence between them had evolved from shocked to accusatory. "All these years," she finally said, "whenever I asked about Vietnam, you'd say, 'Just routine missions.' You let me believe you were some kind of cargo pilot." "It was easier that way," Robert replied, staring at his weathered hands. "For everyone. Easier to lie to your family? Easier than telling my daughter I rained poison on villages." The words emerged before he could stop them, raw and unfiltered. "Easier than admitting I followed orders I knew were wrong." Emily's expression shifted slightly, anger giving way to something more complex. Were there people when you sprayed?" Robert closed his eyes. Behind them, he saw what he always saw: jungle canopy parting beneath his aircraft, mist drifting down, occasional glimpses of thatch roofs, footpaths, rice paddies, sometimes movement, sometimes figures running. "We were told the areas were evacuated," he said finally. "Intelligence reports claimed they were enemy strongholds, supply routes, crop fields feeding Viet Cong." "Were they?" "Sometimes, not always." He opened his eyes, meeting Emily's gaze directly for the first time. "We didn't ask questions. We followed orders." The nurse returned before Emily could respond. Breaking the moment, Dr. Harrison followed, explaining the procedure in clinical terms that washed over Robert like white noise. All he could focus on was Emily's expression, the way 50 years of carefully constructed perception had shattered in an instant. The biopsy itself took less than 30 minutes. Harrison selected the largest growth on Robert's upper back, numbed the area, and extracted a core sample of the mysterious tissue. What emerged wasn't what anyone expected. "That's unusual," Harrison murmured as the sample hit the collection tray. A thick, viscous substance with an oily sheen, darker than blood, and strangely iridescent under the surgical lights. The smell hit them immediately. Chemical, acrid, unmistakable. Robert recognized it instantly. The distinctive odor that had permeated his flight suit after missions, that had lingered on his skin despite multiple showers. "Is that—" he began. "We'll need to run tests," Harrison cut him off, though his expression confirmed Robert's suspicion. "But yes, I believe that's concentrated dioxin somehow preserved in your tissue." Emily pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes wide above her surgical mask. "How is that possible?" "After 50 years? Dioxin has a remarkably long half-life," Harrison explained, carefully securing the sample. "In soil, it can persist for decades. In human tissue, we've documented its presence years after exposure, but this concentration, this physical presentation, it's unprecedented." As Harrison continued the procedure, extracting additional samples, Robert felt a strange sense of inevitability. His body had become a time capsule, preserving evidence of crimes he'd participated in, willing or not. The poison he'd delivered had returned to claim its due. Later, as Emily drove him back to the cabin, both lost in their own thoughts, Robert realized a fundamental shift had occurred. The wall between his war self and civilian self had collapsed. Soon, he suspected, other walls would follow. "There are things I need to tell you," he said quietly, as they turned onto the dirt road leading to his property. "Things I should have told you long ago." Emily's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "About Agent Orange?" "About that. And about you." Her quick glance held confusion, but she remained silent until they reached the cabin. Inside, Robert moved with the careful deliberation of a man in pain, lowering himself into his recliner while Emily stood uncertainly in the center of the sparse living room. "What about me?" she finally asked. Robert gestured toward the bedroom. "There's a metal lockbox under the bed. Combination is 5504. Emily hesitated, then disappeared into the bedroom. Robert heard the scrape of the box being dragged out, the click of the combination lock. Then silence. Long, devastating silence. When she returned, she carried a manila folder yellowed with age, its contents spread in her hands: birth certificate, adoption papers, photographs. Her face had gone pale, eyes wide with shock and dawning comprehension. "What is this?" she whispered, though the answer was evident in the documents she held. "The truth," Robert replied simply. "Your truth." I'm not—" She couldn't complete the sentence, her gaze fixed on the adoption certificate with its Vietnamese government seal. "You were 6 months old," Robert said softly. "From a village near Bien Hoa. An orphanage there was caring for children who'd lost parents in the war. I was stationed nearby for my 3rd tour." "My mother wasn't Margaret?" Emily's voice cracked. "I'm not even American?" "Margaret was your mother in every way that matters," Robert insisted. "She loved you from the moment I brought you home. We both did." "Why?" The single word contained lifetimes of questions. Robert struggled to find words adequate for the moment. How could he explain the complicated tangle of guilt, remorse, and desperate hope that had led him to that Saigon orphanage? "The village you came from," he began slowly, "was in our spray zone. And one of the last missions I flew before my tour ended. Afterward I saw what we'd done." He swallowed hard. "I couldn't undo it, couldn't fix it. But I thought maybe I could save one child." Emily sank onto the couch, documents scattered across her lap. "You took me because you felt guilty?" "At first," Robert admitted, the truth flowing easier now that the dam had broken. "But the moment I held you, it became something else, something real. You became my daughter, not because of guilt, but because I loved you. Margaret and I both did. Does anyone else know? My children? Are they even really your grandchildren?" The questions tumbled out, each one revealing new fractures in Emily's sense of self. "No one knows. And yes, they're as much my grandchildren as you are my daughter." Robert leaned forward despite the pain in his back. "Blood doesn't make family, Emily. Love does." Emily stared at the adoption papers, fingers tracing the unfamiliar name written there, her birth name in a language she couldn't read. "All these years," she whispered, "my whole life has been a lie." "Not a lie," Robert protested. "Just incomplete. Like your transport missions." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. Robert had no defense. They sat in heavy silence as darkness gathered outside, the weight of revelations pressing down on them both. Finally, Emily stood, gathering the documents with mechanical precision. "I need time," she said, her professional demeanor reasserting itself like armor. "I'm going to a hotel tonight. I'll drive you to your follow-up appointment tomorrow, but after that—" She shook her head. "I don't know." Robert nodded, unable to argue, unable to demand forgiveness he hadn't earned. As the door closed behind her, he felt oddly relieved despite the pain, both physical and emotional. After 50 years of secrets, the truth had finally broken free, like poison drawing to the surface. Sleep eluded Robert that night. The cabin, once his fortress against the world, now felt like a mausoleum, a place preserving dead truths and petrified secrets. Each creak of the timber frame echoed like accusation. Each shadow harbored memories he'd spent decades trying to outrun. By morning, fever had set in. The biopsy site throbbed with angry heat that radiated across his back. When Emily arrived, punctual despite everything, her clinical gaze immediately assessed his deteriorated condition. "You need antibiotics," she said, helping him to the car. Her touch was professional, distant. "The biopsy site looks infected." The drive to the VA hospital passed in silence, heavy as lead. Robert wanted to speak, to continue the confession begun yesterday, but fever clouded his thoughts. Instead, he drifted in and out of awareness, fragments of memory surfacing like debris after a storm. Dr. Harrison's face showed immediate concern when they arrived. "This reaction is more severe than I anticipated," he said, examining the angry red inflammation surrounding the biopsy site. The other growths had darkened, their surfaces shiny and taut. "I've started preliminary analysis of the samples," Harrison continued as a nurse administered intravenous antibiotics. "Mr. Walker, I need to ask you some specific questions about your spray missions. Would you prefer to speak privately?" Robert glanced at Emily, who stood by the window, arms crossed defensively across her chest. "No," he said. "No more secrets." Harrison nodded. "The substance we extracted contains concentrated dioxin, TCDD specifically, at levels that shouldn't be biologically possible after 50 years. It's as if your body has been storing it somehow rather than metabolizing it." "Is that why I taste metal all the time?" Robert asked. "Possibly." Dioxin poisoning can cause a range of neurological symptoms. Harrison hesitated. I'd like to bring in some colleagues, specialists in environmental toxicology and veterans' health issues. Your case may help us understand long-term Agent Orange effects that have gone undocumented. You want to make him a research subject? Emily's voice cut through the room, sharp with protective anger despite her personal turmoil. I want to help him, Harrison replied evenly. And potentially thousands of other veterans suffering from exposure-related conditions the VA still doesn't fully recognize. Do it, Robert said before Emily could object further. Whatever helps. The next 2 days became a blur of specialists, blood draws, imaging studies, and increasingly concerned consultations. Robert's condition deteriorated rapidly. The infection resisted standard antibiotics. His fever spiked to dangerous levels, and the growths on his back began to rupture, leaking the same dark, oily substance extracted during the biopsy. Emily remained a constant presence, setting aside her personal shock to advocate fiercely for her father's care. Robert caught glimpses of her in whispered conferences with Harrison, reviewing test results, challenging treatment decisions, demanding answers with the same stubborn determination she'd inherited from him, biological connection or not. On the third morning, Robert woke to find his hospital room transformed into an impromptu conference center. Dr. Harrison stood at the foot of his bed with 3 unfamiliar doctors and, surprisingly, 2 men in civilian clothes whose military bearing was unmistakable. Mr. Walker, Harrison began, I'd like you to meet Dr. Chen from the NIH's Environmental Health Division, Dr. Patel from Walter Reed, and Dr. Morales, who specializes in toxic exposure pathology. He gestured to the 2 men in suits. And these gentlemen are from the Department of Veterans Affairs Central Office. The taller of the 2 stepped forward. Colonel James Whitaker, retired. I head the Agent Orange Settlement Fund Review Board. This is Michael Brennan from our Medical Review Division. Robert attempted to sit up, wincing as pain lanced across his back. Emily appeared at his side, adjusting his bed with practiced efficiency. Why is the VA suddenly interested in my father's case? She asked, suspicion evident in her tone. Whitaker and Brennan exchanged glances. Dr. Harrison's preliminary findings are significant, Whitaker said carefully. We've been monitoring Agent Orange outcomes for decades, but your father's condition presents aspects we haven't documented before. You mean you can't deny it's service-connected when it's literally preserved in his tissue? Emily translated bluntly. Brennan cleared his throat. What we're seeing here could help establish more definitive causal links for other veterans. The preservation of the compound in such concentrated form is unprecedented. Dr. Chen stepped forward. Mr. Walker, with your permission, we'd like to perform a more extensive procedure to remove some of these masses for comprehensive analysis. The implications for understanding dioxin's long-term effects could be groundbreaking. Robert looked to Harrison. What are you actually proposing? Surgical excision of the largest growths, Harrison explained. Essentially, removing the concentrated deposits from your system might actually improve your condition while providing valuable research samples. And if I refuse? The room fell silent. Finally, Dr. Patel spoke with gentle directness. Based on how rapidly your condition has progressed since the biopsy and how the infection is resistant to treatment, without intervention, septicemia is likely. Your organs would begin to fail within days. Emily's hand found Robert's, squeezing tightly. The gesture, their first real connection since the revelations, steadied him. Do the surgery, he said. While the medical team departed to arrange the procedure, Whitaker lingered behind. Walker, he said quietly, you were ranch hand, correct? Which unit? 12th Air Commando Squadron, later 310th Tactical Airlift, Robert replied. Bien Hua and Phu Cat. Whitaker nodded slowly. I was Army, Coochie. Ground pounder. Used to watch you boys flying overhead. Never thought much about it at the time. He hesitated. Been dealing with prostate cancer myself. 3 recurrences. The simple admission created an instant connection. The shared understanding of men who'd survived the war only to continue fighting its legacy in their bodies decades later. They told us it was safe, Robert said. Said you could drink the stuff, it just killed plants. They told us a lot of things, Whitaker replied with a grim smile. Listen, after this is over, whatever they find, your case is approved. Full retroactive benefits. I'll see to it personally. After Whitaker left, Emily returned with pre-surgical paperwork. As she helped Robert navigate the forms, the clinical barrier between them softened slightly. Why didn't you ever tell me? She asked suddenly, her pen pausing over a consent form. About Vietnam. About me. Robert sighed. At first it was classified. Then it was shame. Eventually it was just easier to stay silent. The longer I waited, the harder it became to find the words. He met her gaze directly. I was a coward in ways that had nothing to do with combat. And my birth parents? Do you know anything about them? The question he'd dreaded most. Robert closed his eyes, summoning fragments of memory he'd tried so hard to bury. Your mother's name was Lynn, he said finally. She worked at the orphanage. She told me your father was a teacher in the village before. He couldn't finish the sentence. Before your missions, Emily completed for him, her voice steady. Robert nodded. She asked me to take you to America. Said there was nothing left for you there. The village was gone, the land poisoned. His voice cracked. I think she knew she was sick too. Many of the adults showed symptoms, rashes, breathing problems. Emily was silent for a long moment, absorbing this fragment of her origin story. Do you have any pictures of her? Of the village? In the metal box. There's a smaller envelope I didn't show you. I wasn't ready. I'll look when we get home, Emily said. And the simple statement, assuming a future, assuming a return to the cabin, felt like absolution Robert didn't deserve. The surgery was scheduled for early the next morning. As evening settled over the hospital, Robert found himself alone with his thoughts while Emily went to find dinner. He reached for the small notebook he'd kept by his bedside, a habit from decades of recording nightmares, regrets, and memories too painful to speak aloud. His shaking hand recorded what might be his final entry. The poison is coming out now. After 50 years hiding in my flesh, it's finally surfacing. Maybe that's what confession is, the drawing out of poison that would otherwise kill you from within. I've carried 2 toxic secrets, what I did in Vietnam and who Emily really is. Both are finally exposed to light. Whatever happens tomorrow, that alone feels like redemption I never thought possible. When Emily returned, she found him asleep, the notebook open on his chest. She gently removed it, her eyes catching the final lines. For a long moment she stood watching her father, the man who had committed acts he couldn't forgive, yet who had also saved her, raised her, loved her. The contradiction was impossible to reconcile, yet somehow both truths existed simultaneously. The man who had helped destroy villages had also built a home for a child who needed one. The pilot who had sprayed poison had also spent decades poisoning himself with guilt and shame. That night, as Robert's fever spiked dangerously, Emily kept vigil by his bedside. In the sterile quiet of the hospital room, surrounded by beeping monitors and the antiseptic smell that failed to mask the chemical odor emanating from her father's wounds, she finally allowed herself to weep, not just for the shock of her own disrupted identity, but for the weight her father had carried alone for 50 years. By morning, Robert's fever had risen to 104 degrees. The surgical team moved with heightened urgency, prepping him as Dr. Harrison explained the procedure to Emily. "We'll remove as many of the encapsulated masses as we can safely extract," he said. "The largest concentrations appear to be along his spine and shoulder blades. The procedure carries risks. These formations have developed vascular connections to surrounding tissue." "Will it save him?" Emily asked directly. Harrison's hesitation told her everything. "It should reduce the toxic load his system is processing. Beyond that, we're in uncharted territory." As they wheeled Robert toward surgery, Emily walked alongside, holding his hand until the last possible moment. Just before the doors to the operating room, Robert's eyes fluttered open, surprisingly clear despite the fever. "Emily," he whispered, "no matter what happens, you were the one good thing I brought back from that war, the only thing that mattered." She squeezed his hand, words failing her. As the doors swung closed between them, Emily realized that regardless of blood, regardless of origin, regardless of the lies and secrets between them, Robert Walker was her father. The man who had taught her to ride a bike, who had checked for monsters under her bed, who had walked her down the aisle at her wedding. What happened next would either be a new beginning or an ending. Either way, the truth, all of it, was finally surfacing, like the poison that had lurked beneath Robert's skin for half a century. The surgical suite hummed with tension as Dr. Harrison made the first incision along Robert's spine. 6 other medical professionals stood in attendance, an unusually large team reflecting both the procedure's complexity and its unprecedented nature. Through the observation window, representatives from the VA, NIH, and Walter Reed watched with clinical interest. "Beginning primary excision," Harrison announced, his voice steady despite the extraordinary scene unfolding beneath his scalpel. The initial incision released a flood of dark fluid that immediately triggered alarms on the monitoring equipment. The anesthesiologist moved quickly to stabilize Robert's dropping blood pressure as Harrison worked to contain the unexpected hemorrhage. "It's not blood," the surgical assistant noted, her voice tight with confusion. "Consistency is wrong." Harrison nodded grimly. "Get samples to toxicology immediately." "Continue suction." As they cleared the site, what lay beneath the skin defied conventional medical understanding. The largest growth wasn't merely a cyst or tumor, but a complex mass with its own apparent vasculature, spreading tendrils that had integrated with Robert's muscle tissue and nervous system. "This is unlike anything I've encountered," Harrison murmured, carefully tracing the boundaries where the mass interfaced with healthy tissue. "It's as if the dioxin compounds somehow reorganized cellular structures over decades." The observation room buzzed with urgent whispers as specialists watched the extraordinary revelation. This wasn't merely an accumulation of toxic compounds. It was evidence of how a human body, over 50 years, had responded to one of the most potent environmental poisons ever deployed in warfare. "Careful around the spinal column," Harrison directed as they approached the central mass. "These formations appear to have neural connections we didn't anticipate." For 4 grueling hours, the surgical team methodically excised growth after growth, collecting each specimen with painstaking precision for the awaiting research teams. As they removed the largest concentrations, Robert's vital signs gradually stabilized, as if each extraction lifted a burden from his overtaxed system. In the waiting room, Emily sat alone, alternating between reviewing her father's medical charts with professional detachment and staring blankly at old photographs she'd retrieved from the cabin that morning, images of herself as a toddler on Robert's shoulders, Margaret teaching her to bake cookies, family camping trips where Robert seemed almost happy, briefly freed from the shadows that typically haunted his eyes. Parallel to these were the contents of the smaller envelope she'd finally examined, faded photographs of a Vietnamese woman holding an infant, standing before a simple wooden structure. On the back, in Robert's precise handwriting, Lynn and Emily, Bien Hoa Orphanage, 1970. Her birth mother's face, serious, dignified, with eyes that somehow reminded Emily of her own daughters, seemed to gaze across decades and continents, bridging a divide Emily hadn't known existed until yesterday. "Miss Walker?" Emily looked up to find Colonel Whitaker standing before her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one wordlessly, which she accepted with a nod. "Your father's surgery is progressing well," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "Dr. Harrison is optimistic." "You have access to updates?" Emily asked, surprised. Whitaker's smile was humorless. "When something potentially redefines our understanding of Agent Orange effects, the VA takes notice." He glanced at the photographs in her lap. "Family albums?" Emily hesitated, then handed him the photograph of Lynn. "My birth mother, apparently." If Whitaker was surprised by this revelation, he masked it well. He studied the image with respectful attention. "Vietnamese?" "Yes. My father adopted me after his missions in the area." Whitaker was quiet for a moment. Many men came back from Vietnam carrying guilt they never shed. Some drank it away. Some ended their lives. Some just disappeared into themselves. He handed the photograph back carefully. "Your father found a different path." "By taking a war orphan?" "By trying to make something right in the midst of so much wrong." Whitaker's gaze was steady. "I've reviewed his service records since Dr. Harrison contacted us. Your father flew more ranch hand missions than almost anyone in his squadron." "But there's something else in his file you should know." Emily tensed, unsure if she could absorb any more revelations. "In late 1969, your father was disciplined for deliberately missing spray targets. Multiple instances where telemetry showed him releasing Agent Orange over uninhabited jungle instead of designated village areas." Whitaker leaned forward. He risked court-martial to avoid civilian exposures. Not many did. The information settled over Emily like a missing puzzle piece. Before she could respond, Dr. Harrison appeared in the doorway, surgical cap in hand. His exhausted expression gave nothing away as he approached. "The procedure is complete," he said, taking the seat across from Emily. "We've removed approximately 80% of the encapsulated dioxin masses. Your father is in recovery now, stable but critical." "Will he recover?" Emily asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Harrison's expression softened. "His vital signs improved significantly as we removed the largest concentrations. The fever is already reducing." "But Emily," he leaned forward, "your father's been carrying lethal levels of dioxin in his tissues for decades. The damage to his organs is extensive." "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning he'll need specialized care going forward. Liver and kidney function are compromised. There's evidence of peripheral neuropathy, potential cardiovascular complications." Harrison paused. "But he's alive, which frankly exceeds my expectations given what we found." "When can I see him?" "He'll be in post-op for another hour, then intensive care. You can see him briefly once he's settled." Harrison hesitated. "There's something else you should know. While he was under anesthesia, your father spoke extensively." Emily frowned. "Spoke? While unconscious?" "It happens sometimes with certain anesthetic combinations. Patients verbalize memories or thoughts." Harrison's discomfort was evident. "Your father described his missions in remarkable detail. Villages, coordinates, dates. He named specific locations where spraying occurred that don't appear in any official ranch hand records. Whitaker straightened in his chair. "Are you certain about that, Doctor?" The surgical team recorded everything as potential medical evidence, but yes, he described spray operations in areas previously undocumented in official reports. Harrison's gaze shifted between them, including details about a village called An Loch Nin, where he claimed to have deliberately aborted a spray mission after seeing children in the target zone. He described landing at an unauthorized location to warn villagers before other aircraft arrived. Emily felt her throat tighten. "And Loch Nin. Is that where—" "According to what he said during the procedure, yes. That's where he later returned to find you." Harrison's voice gentled. "He spoke about a promise made to your birth mother, that he would tell you the truth someday. A promise, 50 years in the breaking." Emily closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the cascade of revelations. "Dr. Harrison," Whitaker interjected, "I'd appreciate copies of those recordings for the VA's historical documentation. There are still significant gaps in our understanding of the ranch hand operational areas." "You'll need to discuss that with Mr. Walker when he's recovered," Harrison replied firmly. "Those statements were made under medical circumstances and remain protected information." The unspoken tension between the government representative and the doctor was clear. The same tension that had existed for decades between veterans seeking recognition and a system reluctant to acknowledge the full scope of Agent Orange's impact. When Emily was finally allowed to see Robert in intensive care, she barely recognized the frail figure amid the tangle of monitoring equipment and IV lines. His normally tanned face had a gray pallor and bandages covered much of his torso where the growths had been removed. She sat beside him, gently taking his hand, the hand that had both released poison and, later, held her as a child. The contradiction remained impossible to fully reconcile, yet somehow both truths existed simultaneously in this broken man who was her father. Robert's eyes flickered open, focusing slowly on her face. Recognition dawned, followed by something like peace. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice raw from the intubation tube. "Of course I'm here," Emily replied, surprised by her own certainty. "I'm your daughter." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Did they get it out? The poison?" "Most of it. You're going to need time to recover, but Dr. Harrison is optimistic." Robert nodded slightly, then frowned. "I had dreams during surgery. About Vietnam. About your mother. Dr. Harrison mentioned you spoke while under anesthesia. Did I tell them about An Loch Nin?" Concern flashed across his face. "About the unauthorized landing?" Emily squeezed his hand gently. "Yes. And about how you warned the villagers." Robert's eyes closed briefly. "That was the day I decided I couldn't do it anymore. We were briefed that the area was clear, just jungle and Viet Cong supply routes. But as we approached, I saw people in the fields below. Children." His voice cracked. "I dumped the load in the uninhabited jungle nearby and radioed false coordinates, then landed at a field station to warn them another squadron was coming the next day." "That's where you met my birth mother?" "Lynn was a translator for American forces. She helped evacuate the village that night." His gaze met Emily's, steady despite his weakness. 3 months later, when I returned for my final rotation, the village was gone, defoliated by the squadron that came after us. Lynn had taken orphaned children to Bien Hoa. She was showing symptoms already: skin lesions, respiratory problems. "Why me?" Emily asked the question that had haunted her since the revelation. "Out of all those children, why did you choose me?" Robert's eyes welled with tears. "Lynn said you were the daughter of the village teacher, the man who had helped coordinate the evacuation after my warning. He and his wife died from exposure during the second spraying." He drew a shaky breath. She said you had his eyes. Eyes that saw everything, missed nothing. She believed you were meant for more than an orphanage in a dying country. The monitors registered Robert's increasing distress as he spoke. A nurse appeared, checking his vital signs with concern. "That's enough for now," she said firmly to Emily. "He needs rest." Emily nodded, rising reluctantly. "I'll be back tomorrow. We have a lot more to talk about." Robert caught her hand as she turned to leave. "Emily," he whispered, "in the cabin, under the floorboards where the lockbox was, there's a journal, my war journal. Everything is there, every mission, every decision, every regret. I want you to read it, all of it. No more secrets." As Emily left the hospital that evening, the weight of untold histories pressed upon her, not just her father's, but her own. The revelation of her origins explained so much that had always felt slightly misaligned in her life. Her physical differences from her parents, her inexplicable dreams of unfamiliar landscapes, her lifelong pull toward healing professions. She drove to the cabin in gathering darkness, the familiar dirt road now leading to a place transformed by truth. Inside, the simple rooms held different shadows, not just a reclusive veteran's refuge, but the sanctuary of a man who had sought redemption through fatherhood. Kneeling on the bedroom floor, Emily pried up the loose boards where the lockbox had been hidden. Beneath them lay a battered green notebook with a military insignia embossed on its cover. Her father's war journal, the final repository of secrets half a century in the keeping. As rain began to drum against the cabin's tin roof, Emily settled into Robert's recliner and opened the first page, ready at last to know the full truth of her father, her origins, and the intertwined histories that had brought them both to this moment of reckoning. The journal's first entry was dated June 14, 1968, Robert's first day in Vietnam. The handwriting was neater than Emily had ever seen from her father, the words of a younger man still clinging to military precision. As she turned the pages, his careful script gradually deteriorated, mirroring his disillusionment with each passing month. July 30th, 1968. First ranch hand mission today. They call it defoliation, stripping the jungle to expose enemy movements. Simple enough in briefings. Different when you're actually releasing the stuff. Smells chemical even through oxygen masks. Captain says it's harmless to people, just kills plants. So why do we need protective gear? Emily read for hours, absorbing her father's transformation from dutiful airman to reluctant participant to silent objector. The journal documented not just missions, but the gradual awakening of conscience. November 15, 1968. Village on today's spray map. Intelligence swears it's evacuated, just VC now. Saw children running as we approached, couldn't do it, released late over jungle instead, reported equipment malfunction, not sure how long I can keep this up. February 2nd, 1969. 3 men in our unit developing strange rashes. Armstrong has uncontrollable shaking in his hands, doctors calling it stress reaction. We all know it's the chemicals. Nobody's saying it out loud. April 18, 1969. Court-martial rumors for pattern of mission irregularities. Major pulled me aside today. Said he knows what I'm doing. Expected a reprimand. Got a whispered good man instead. Maybe I'm not the only one with doubts. The entries grew darker as 1969 progressed, documenting Robert's increasing certainty that Agent Orange was harming both Vietnamese civilians and American personnel. Then came the pivotal entry, August 22, 1969, made unauthorized landing near An Loc Nen today after deliberately missing spray coordinates. Village was full, not evacuated as briefed. Used bogus mechanical issue as cover. Connected with Army translator. Woman named Lynn. She helped warn village elders about tomorrow's scheduled spray. Some kind of school teacher took charge of evacuation, felt human for the first time in months, could face court-martial if discovered, don't care anymore. 3 months later, Robert returned to find devastation. November 17, 1969, and Loch Ninh is gone. Not just evacuated, destroyed. Vegetation dead, discolored. Found Lynn at Bien Hoa Orphanage. Most adults who remained show symptoms: rashes, breathing problems, strange growths. Children, too. School teacher and wife died from exposure. Their baby daughter survived, currently at orphanage. Lynn says chemicals linger in soil, water. No one will admit this publicly. What have we done? The final Vietnam entries detailed Robert's decision to adopt Emily, the bureaucratic maneuvers, the strings pulled, the money exchanged to falsify documents, the terrifying flight home with a sedated infant, and the fear of discovery. March 5, 1970. Emily asleep in makeshift carrier as we cross Pacific, Margaret waiting in San Diego thinking we're adopting American war orphan. Not sure she'll accept the truth. Not sure I can tell her the whole truth. This child is my penance and my redemption. I will give her everything the war took from her. I will never let the poison touch her. Emily set down the journal, tears streaming unchecked. Her entire existence was built on a foundation of tragedy, conscience, and a desperate bid for redemption. The knowledge settled over her like a physical weight, not just who she was, but why she was. Dawn was breaking as she finished reading, the cabin gradually revealing itself in gray morning light. She moved stiffly to the window, looking out at the woods her father had hidden in for decades. Beyond the trees, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from the hospital. "Ms. Walker, this is night nursing. Your father's experiencing complications. Dr. Harrison suggests you come in as soon as possible." Emily drove through morning mist with mechanical focus, the journal secure in her bag. At the hospital, she found Dr. Harrison in rumpled scrubs, clearly having worked through the night. "His kidneys are failing," Harrison said without preamble. "The toxin removal seems to have triggered cascade organ failure, something we feared might happen but hoped to avoid. Can you treat it? We're doing everything possible. Dialysis is supporting kidney function, and we've prioritized liver support, but—" Harrison's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Emily, the damage from decades of dioxin exposure is profound. His systems were compromised long before surgery. Is he conscious?" "Intermittently. He's been asking for you." Robert looked impossibly frail beneath the hospital blankets, skin yellowed with jaundice, face gaunt. The vital signs monitor told a story of systems in distress. Yet when Emily entered, his eyes found her with perfect clarity. "You read it?" he whispered. Emily nodded, taking his hand. "All of it. Then you know everything. Why didn't you tell me? All these years." Robert's fingers tightened weakly around hers. "Shame. Fear you'd hate me for my part in it. Fear of admitting what America did there." His breathing labored. "Easier to be the silent veteran than the man who rained poison on villages. Easier to be your father than your kidnapper." "You didn't kidnap me," Emily said firmly. "You saved me. The journal makes that clear." Robert's eyes closed briefly. "Did you read about the other pilots? The ones who followed orders without question?" "Who knew there were people below?" "Yes. I wasn't so different," he confessed. "I followed orders too long. Told myself I was just doing my job. By the time I started dumping loads away from targets, hundreds of villages were already destroyed, thousands of people poisoned. His voice cracked. Your parents among them. Emily struggled to reconcile the complicated truth. Her adoptive father had participated in the system that killed her birth parents, yet had also tried to save them, then saved her. The journal said my birth father was a teacher, and he helped evacuate the village after your warning? Robert nodded weakly. Tran Min, school principal. He got most villagers to safety before the second squadron came, then returned for stragglers. Died from direct exposure. His eyes sought hers. Lin said you had his determination, his ethical compass. And my birth mother? Huang, village midwife, died same week as your father. He swallowed painfully. Lin had photos of them in the envelope. Emily nodded, recalling the other photograph she'd discovered, a serious-looking man in glasses beside a petite woman with kind eyes. Her birth parents preserved in fading images strangers who had given her life. I have their pictures, she said. I found them this morning. Relief flickered across Robert's face. Good. You should know them. Where you come from. A nurse entered to check Robert's vital signs, adjusting medication with tight-lipped concern. When she left, Robert seemed to have expended his limited energy, eyes closing despite his efforts to stay present. Emily sat holding his hand, watching his labored breathing, feeling the surreal collision of past and present. Outside the room, she glimpsed Whitaker in conversation with Harrison, their expressions grave. When Robert stirred again an hour later, his gaze was unfocused, mind clearly drifting between present and past. The village, he murmured. Can still smell it burning. It's okay, Dad, Emily soothed, the title coming naturally despite everything. You're in the hospital. His eyes found hers with sudden clarity. Need to tell you something important about the spray missions. You already did. It's all in the journal. No. He struggled to focus. More than that. Records were falsified. Spray zones much larger than officially reported. Entire provinces contaminated. Government knows. Has always known. Emily leaned closer. What are you saying? Maps in the green lockbox. My real mission logs. Documented everything they told us to hide. His breathing grew more labored. Whitaker. Give them to Whitaker. He's one of the good ones. Fighting for veterans. Before Emily could respond, alarms erupted from the monitoring equipment. Robert's blood pressure plummeted as medical staff rushed in, pushing Emily aside as they fought to stabilize him. In the waiting room, time stretched unbearably. Emily clutched the journal, mind reeling with implications of what Robert had just revealed, not just about her adoption, but about the true scope of Agent Orange deployment. If his claims were true, the documented spray zones were deliberate underestimations, meaning potentially thousands more veterans and Vietnamese civilians had been exposed than officially acknowledged. Dr. Harrison finally emerged, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. We've stabilized him for now, he said, sitting heavily beside Emily, but his organs are shutting down systematically, kidneys completely failed, liver function at less than 20%, heart showing arrhythmia. He met her gaze directly. I'm sorry, but we're looking at hours, not days. The clinical assessment hit Emily with physical force. He mentioned maps, she said numbly. Mission logs that show the real spray zones were larger than reported. Harrison's expression shifted subtly. Did he say where these documents are? At the cabin, a green lockbox. Emily studied Harrison's reaction. He said to give them to Colonel Whitaker, that it could help other veterans. That kind of evidence, Harrison chose his words carefully. If verified, it could force a reassessment of thousands of denied VA claims. Areas not previously recognized as spray zones could be acknowledged. Veterans dying without benefits could finally receive proper care. The weight of the revelation settled over Emily. Her father's final act might be his most redemptive. "I need to get those documents," she said, rising. "Your father's condition is critical," Harrison reminded her gently. "If you leave now—" The unspoken truth hung between them. If she left, she might not see Robert alive again. Emily sank back into her chair, torn between her father's immediate needs and his apparent dying wish to expose a truth that might help countless others. "I'll stay," she decided. "The documents have waited 50 years. They can wait a few more hours." When she returned to Robert's room, his condition had deteriorated further. Machinery now breathed for him. Medications maintained his failing heart's rhythm. Emily sat beside him, holding his hand, speaking softly about memories from her childhood, camping trips where he'd taught her constellations, patient hours teaching her to ride a bicycle, his pride at her college graduation. Whether he heard her remained unclear, but speaking the memories aloud felt necessary, acknowledging the complex, flawed, loving man who had raised her, regardless of blood or origin. As night fell, the hospital quieted. Emily dozed in the uncomfortable chair, still holding Robert's hand, jerking awake at every change in the rhythm of the machines keeping him alive. During one such moment of wakefulness, she found Robert's eyes open, watching her with unexpected lucidity. "Emily," he whispered, voice barely audible beneath the oxygen mask. "Forgive me." She leaned closer. "For what? Taking me from Vietnam? That gave me a life, Dad." He shook his head slightly. "For the silence, for not telling you the truth, for being a coward." "You're not a coward," Emily insisted. "Your journal shows that. You risked everything to save villagers, to save me. Too little, too late." His eyes drifted closed, then opened with effort. "But you were the one good thing, the one thing I did right." The monitors began to signal distress as Robert's heartbeat grew irregular. Emily pressed the call button, but before staff could respond, Robert rallied slightly, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "Promise," he gasped. "The maps, the truth. Make it right." "I promise," Emily whispered. "I'll make sure everyone knows." A ghost of a smile touched Robert's lips. Then his eyes widened, focusing on something beyond Emily, beyond the room itself. His expression transformed with wonder, fear, and finally, a profound relief. "They're here," he whispered. "All of them. The villages, the children." His gaze returned to Emily's face. "They've been waiting for me to tell the truth." The heart monitor flatlined before Emily could respond. Medical staff flooded the room, initiating resuscitation protocols as she was ushered outside. Through the window, she watched them work with methodical urgency, but somehow knew it was futile. Robert Walker had carried his poison, both physical and metaphorical, for 50 years. In the end, the weight had been too much for his body to bear. But in his final days, he had released the most toxic burden of all, his silence. In the quiet aftermath, as staff disconnected machines and prepared forms, Emily sat beside her father's still form. For the first time since she'd known him, his face appeared truly peaceful, unburdened by the secrets that had haunted him for half a century. "Doctor." Harrison entered softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Emily." He fought hard. She nodded, unable to speak. "His suffering is over," Harrison added. "And what we learned from his case will help countless others. That's a significant legacy." Emily thought of the maps, still hidden at the cabin, of her promise to expose the fuller truth. "His legacy may be even greater than you know," she said quietly. As dawn broke over the hospital, Emily signed the necessary forms and gathered her father's few possessions. Outside, Colonel Whitaker waited respectfully by his car. "I heard about your father," he said. "I'm truly sorry for your loss." "He mentioned documents," Emily said without preamble. "Maps showing the actual spray zones were larger than officially reported. He wanted you to have them." Whitaker's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, hope, perhaps, or determination. "If such documents exist, they would be significant, potentially transformative for thousands of veterans and their families." "They exist," Emily replied with certainty, "and I intend to honor his final wish. But first, I need to bury my father." As she drove away from the hospital, Emily felt the weight of dual legacies settling upon her shoulders, the personal inheritance of her complex origins and the broader mission her father had entrusted to her in his final moments. Both demanded acknowledgement. Both required courage. The cabin stood silent in morning light, no longer simply her father's refuge, but the repository of truths that might finally bring justice to those still suffering from a war long officially ended, but still claiming casualties decades later. Robert Walker was buried with military honors on a crisp autumn morning, his casket draped with the American flag that had spent decades folded in his closet. The ceremony was small. Emily and her family, a handful of locals who had known Quiet Bob from a distance, and surprisingly a contingent of aging veterans who arrived in a convoy of pickup trucks adorned with faded service stickers. Emily hadn't invited them. They simply appeared, forming a solemn line in worn service caps and jackets that no longer fit properly over bodies changed by time and illness. Some used canes or leaned on oxygen tanks. Others bore visible scars or tremors, men bound together by shared experiences that civilians could never fully comprehend. Colonel Whitaker stood among them, acting as unofficial liaison. "Word spreads quickly in veteran communities," he explained to Emily after the service. "When they heard about your father's case, what the surgery revealed, many recognized their own symptoms. They've come to pay respects to a brother who might help them finally get recognition." The green lockbox sat in Emily's car throughout the funeral, retrieved from beneath the cabin floorboards that morning. She hadn't yet examined its contents, feeling that should wait until after her father was properly laid to rest. Now, as mourners dispersed, Whitaker approached with careful respect. "About those documents your father mentioned," Emily nodded toward her car. "I have them. But before I hand anything over, I need to understand exactly what will happen with this information." Whitaker's expression remained neutral, but Emily caught the subtle shift in his posture, a military man recognizing terms of negotiation. "Why don't we discuss this somewhere more appropriate?" he suggested, glancing around the cemetery. An hour later, Emily sat across from Whitaker in a private room at the local VFW hall, the lockbox open between them. Its contents were meticulously organized, hand-drawn maps with detailed annotations, official military coordinates alongside Robert's actual spray locations, photographs taken surreptitiously from his aircraft, and most damning, copies of orders explicitly directing pilots to falsify mission reports regarding spray zones near populated areas. "Jesus Christ," Whitaker muttered, carefully examining a map from 1969 showing spray coverage nearly double the officially acknowledged area. "This is comprehensive." "My father was thorough," Emily replied, "and apparently prescient about the need for documentation." Whitaker nodded grimly. "Many of us suspected the discrepancies, but this level of proof—" He looked up at Emily. "You understand what this means? That thousands of veterans exposed to Agent Orange in supposedly clean areas have been denied benefits based on falsified records. That the government has known all along the true extent of contamination." Emily's voice remained steady. "That my father participated in both the crime and the cover-up, and ultimately chose to expose it," Whitaker added. "That matters. What will the VA do with this information?" Whitaker's hesitation told Emily everything she needed to know. "That's what I thought," she said. "Institutional self-preservation?" "It's more complicated than that," Whitaker sighed. "These documents would force a re-evaluation of thousands of rejected claims, potentially billions in retroactive benefits, acknowledgement of decades of denials." He carefully refolded a map. "There will be tremendous pressure to discredit or suppress this evidence." "Then why should I give it to you at all?" "Because I'm not the institution," Whitaker replied simply. "I'm a dying man trying to help other dying men get what they deserve before it's too late." His directness caught Emily off guard. "Terminal prostate cancer, Agent Orange presumptive condition, took me 15 years of fighting to get my own benefits approved." The revelation shifted Emily's perspective. This wasn't merely a government representative, but a fellow victim with personal stakes. "What's your actual plan?" she asked. Careful, strategic pressure. "These documents go to 3 places simultaneously: VA Central Office, Congressional Veterans Affairs Committee, and selected media outlets." Whitaker leaned forward. "The key is making it impossible to silence the information. Once it's in multiple hands, the only viable response is acknowledgement and action." Emily considered his strategy. "My father's medical case provides the physical evidence. These documents provide the administrative proof. Together they make a compelling case that can't be easily dismissed." "Exactly." Whitaker nodded. "Dr. Harrison's findings from your father's surgery are already creating waves in VA medical circles. Combined with these maps," he gestured to the documents, "it's the most significant Agent Orange evidence to emerge in decades." "I want to be involved," Emily stated firmly, "not just turning over documents, but participating in how this story reaches the public. My father entrusted this to me for a reason." Whitaker studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Your involvement would actually strengthen the narrative. The daughter of a ranch hand pilot, who happens to be a Vietnamese adoptee, advocating for both American veterans and Vietnamese victims." He didn't finish the thought, but the strategic value was clear. The conversation shifted to specifics. Which documents would be most compelling? Which congressional representatives were sympathetic to veterans' causes? Which journalists had demonstrated integrity on military accountability stories? Throughout the discussion, Emily felt her father's presence, not the broken man who had died in the hospital, but the young pilot who had meticulously documented truth even while participating in its concealment. When they finished, Emily retained originals of all documents while providing Whitaker with complete copies. Their agreement was memorialized in writing: a timeline for disclosure, requirements for proper attribution to Robert Walker, and protections for Emily's family privacy. As Whitaker prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Your father's actions were complicated, both right and wrong. But in the end, he chose truth. That's rarer than you might think." After Whitaker departed, Emily remained alone in the quiet room, surrounded by the evidence of her father's moral journey, from complicity to resistance to final confession. The dual revelations of her own origins and her father's role in the war had initially seemed separate shocks, but she now recognized their profound interconnection. Robert had sought redemption by saving her, then spent decades protecting her from the truth of both their histories. That evening, Emily returned to the cabin, now legally hers, and began the painful process of sorting through her father's possessions. Among his few personal items, she discovered a small wooden box containing military medals never displayed, letters from her mother during his deployment, and a worn photograph of a much younger Robert standing beside his aircraft, smiling with the confident assurance of a man who still believed in his mission. The contrast between that young pilot and the haunted man she'd known as her father was stark. Vietnam had not merely changed him, it had fundamentally altered his understanding of himself and his country. His subsequent life choices, isolation, silence, the adoption of an enemy's child, all stemmed from that transformation. 3 days after the funeral, the first media story broke in a national newspaper. Veteran's autopsy reveals unprecedented Agent Orange evidence. The article detailed Dr. Harrison's findings without mentioning the maps or expanded spray zones. That revelation was strategically scheduled for the following week, after congressional representatives had been briefed. The initial story generated immediate response. Veterans organizations issued statements demanding expanded research. The VA announced a special committee to evaluate implications. Medical researchers requested access to Robert's tissue samples and surgical records. Emily watched the gathering momentum with mixed emotions. Her father was becoming a symbol. His personal tragedy transformed into a public narrative of government accountability and delayed justice. It was necessary, important work, yet it sometimes obscured the complex, flawed man she had known and loved. On the evening before the full document disclosure was scheduled, Emily received an unexpected visitor at the cabin. Dr. Harrison arrived unannounced, his expression grave. "I apologize for coming without calling," he said as Emily invited him inside, "but there's something you need to know before tomorrow's announcements." Emily felt a flicker of apprehension. "Has something happened with the VA?" "Not exactly." Harrison accepted the offered seat at Robert's kitchen table. "It's about your father's medical samples. The toxicology results are extraordinary." "I thought we already knew that. Concentrated dioxin preserved in tissue." "It's more specific than that." Harrison hesitated. "The chemical signature is unique, a specific formulation used only in early Agent Orange batches produced by a single manufacturer. The company has spent decades denying this particular formulation was ever deployed in Vietnam." Emily processed this new information. "So my father's tissue proves not just general Agent Orange exposure, but links to a specific corporate manufacturer who has denied responsibility?" "Exactly. And there's more." Harrison placed a folder on the table. "Cross-referencing the chemical markers with your father's maps shows that this particular formulation was used primarily in the expanded spray zones, the areas officially denied in government records." The implications clicked into place. So the manufacturer and the military knew these areas were sprayed with a particularly toxic formulation, and both have denied it for 50 years. Harrison nodded grimly. "While thousands of veterans died from exposure they couldn't prove." Emily opened the folder, reviewing the technical analyses she only partially understood. "Is this information included in tomorrow's disclosure?" "That's why I'm here. Whitaker doesn't know about these findings yet. They came directly to me as the treating physician." Harrison met her gaze directly. "This significantly raises the stakes. We're not just challenging government records now, but directly implicating a powerful corporation in knowingly supplying a particularly toxic formulation." The weight of this new dimension settled heavily. "What are the potential consequences?" "Legal action from the manufacturer is certain. They'll attempt to discredit everything, your father's records, his medical findings, possibly even his military service." Harrison's expression softened. "They might even attempt to use his complicated history, including your adoption, to undermine his credibility." Emily felt a cold clarity descending. Her father had carried physical poison in his body for 50 years. Now she was inheriting the burden of toxic truth. "Do you think we should delay?" she asked. Harrison considered the question carefully. "I think the veterans who are still suffering and dying deserve the truth, however complicated or dangerous it might be to reveal it." Emily nodded, decision crystallizing. "Then we include everything, the chemical analysis, the manufacturer identification, all of it. My father spent 50 years hiding from truth. I won't continue that pattern." After Harrison left, Emily sat alone in her father's chair, surrounded by the simple possessions of a man who had lived with unbearable knowledge. The cabin, once a place of secrets and silence, now felt like the epicenter of a coming storm. Her phone buzzed with a text from Whitaker. "Media briefing scheduled for 10 a.m. tomorrow. Last chance to reconsider." Emily replied simply, "Proceeding as planned. Adding additional chemical analysis documentation. Will explain tomorrow." That night, Emily dreamed of Vietnam. Not the war-torn country from history books, but lush green fields and villages she'd never seen yet somehow recognized. In the dream, she walked alongside a man with glasses who pointed out medicinal plants and spoke of education's importance. A woman with her same eyes showed her how to hold a baby properly. They spoke to her in a language she didn't understand yet somehow comprehended. She woke before dawn with tears on her face and a profound sense of connection to people she'd never known but whose blood she carried. Her father had given her an American life, protection from war's horrors, opportunities her birth parents could never have provided. Yet in his desperate attempt to shield her from painful truths, he had also denied her knowledge of her origins, her first language, her birth culture, her ancestral homeland. As morning light filtered through the cabin windows, Emily made another decision. After the documents were released, after the media storm subsided, she would go to Vietnam. She would find An Loc Ninh, or whatever remained of it. She would seek any records of Tran Minh and Huong, her birth parents. She would reclaim that piece of herself while honoring her father's redemptive final act. The truth, in all its complexity, deserved nothing less. 1 year later, Emily stood in the center of what had once been her father's sparse living room, now transformed. The cabin's dark wood walls were brightened with framed photographs. Robert in his Air Force uniform, beside images of Tran Minh and Huong and their village, her American and Vietnamese heritage displayed with equal prominence. Bookshelves held volumes on Vietnamese culture and history alongside medical texts and family photo albums. Through the window, she could see the garden flourishing in spring sunshine, tomatoes, green beans, and herbs growing alongside exotic plants with purple and white blooms native to Vietnam. The garden had been Robert's final project, begun in those weeks before his collapse, now expanded under Emily's care into something that bridged two worlds. "Mom, are they here yet?" called her daughter Jessica from the porch, where she was arranging chairs in preparation for the afternoon gathering. "Not yet, honey." Colonel Whitaker said around 2. Emily checked her watch. Still an hour to prepare. The past year had unfolded in ways Emily could never have anticipated. The release of Robert's maps and documentation, combined with the damning chemical analysis linking specific Agent Orange formulations to previously denied spray zones, had created a seismic shift in Veterans Affairs policy. After initial attempts to question the evidence, the overwhelming scientific corroboration from Robert's tissue samples had forced acknowledgement of the expanded contamination areas. The congressional hearings that followed became national news, gray-haired veterans testifying about decades of denied claims, medical experts confirming the unique chemical signatures found in Robert's body, and most powerfully, Emily herself presenting her father's meticulously maintained records alongside the story of her own adoption from a sprayed village. The chemical manufacturer had indeed fought back, deploying teams of lawyers and public relations specialists to question the evidence. But the combination of Robert's physical proof, military documentation, and Emily's compelling personal narrative proved too powerful to discredit. 3 months after the initial disclosure, the VA announced expanded presumptive condition coverage for veterans who had served in the newly acknowledged spray zones. For thousands of aging veterans, the policy change meant access to medical care and benefits long denied. For Emily, it meant her father's final act had achieved the redemption he sought. though the full scope of accountability remained incomplete, with many Vietnamese victims still unrecognized by American authorities. The door opened as Emily's husband Michael entered, carrying grocery bags for the gathering. "Parking's already getting tight down by the road," he reported. "I think we might have more than just the core group coming today." Emily nodded, unsurprised. What had begun as informal support meetings for local veterans affected by the Walker disclosure, as the media had dubbed it, had gradually expanded to include family members, medical professionals, and eventually Vietnamese American community representatives seeking recognition for civilian victims. Today marked the first anniversary of Robert's passing, and word had spread that the gathering at Walker Cabin would include an announcement regarding the newly established Walker Foundation, the organization Emily had created using the settlement from the chemical manufacturer who had finally conceded liability rather than face a class action lawsuit from thousands of veterans with newly validated claims. "Need help with those sandwiches?" Michael asked, setting down the groceries. "I've got it," Emily replied, continuing to arrange platters. "Why don't you help Jessica with the chairs? We might need to set up the overflow in the side yard." As Michael stepped outside, Emily paused at the kitchen window, watching her family move around the property that had once been her father's isolated refuge. The transformation of both the physical space and its purpose felt right, a healing conversion from solitary suffering to community support. Her trip to Vietnam 6 months earlier had completed another circle. With the help of Vietnamese government officials, surprisingly cooperative once they understood her connection to the Agent Orange disclosure, Emily had located what remained of An Loc Ninh. The village had been gradually resettled in the decades following the war, though the soil remained contaminated in some areas. No direct relatives of her birth parents had been found, but elderly villagers recalled the respected teacher and his midwife wife. In a particularly moving encounter, a 70-year-old woman who had been one of her father's students produced a faded class photograph with Tran Minh standing proudly among village children. "He was very brave," the woman had told Emily through an interpreter. "When the planes came, he organized everyone to leave. He saved many lives." Emily had left copies of her birth parents' photographs with the village elders and established a scholarship fund for local children. The connection felt incomplete yet profound, an acknowledgement of roots she would continue to explore throughout her life. The sound of vehicles on the gravel drive pulled Emily from her reflections. Through the window, she saw several cars arriving, veterans in their 70s emerging slowly, many with the assistance of canes or family members. Among them was Colonel Whitaker, thinner than he had been a year ago, as cancer continued its steady advance, but still carrying himself with military bearing. Emily stepped onto the porch to greet them. These men had become something between family and comrades over the past year, bonded by shared purpose despite their different connections to the Agent Orange legacy. They had stood with her through congressional testimony, media interviews, and the inevitable backlash from those with vested interests in maintaining official narratives. "James," she called, using Whitaker's first name as he'd finally insisted after months of formality. "How was the drive from Memphis?" "Scenic as always," he replied with a thin smile. "The others are right behind me. Bigger turnout than expected. Word about your announcement has traveled fast." By 2:30, the gathering had swelled beyond anticipation. Nearly 60 people occupied the chairs arranged across the property, veterans and their families, local community members, a few medical professionals, including Dr. Harrison, and representatives from veterans advocacy organizations. They formed a living testament to the ripple effects of one man's final confession. Emily stood before them, notes in hand but speaking mostly from the heart. "A year ago today, my father, Robert Walker, passed away after decades of carrying both physical and metaphorical poison in his body. His decision to finally speak the truth about Agent Orange deployment has helped thousands of veterans receive long overdue recognition and care. She paused, looking across the gathered faces. But American accountability remains incomplete while Vietnamese civilian victims continue to suffer without acknowledgement or assistance. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. That's why today, I'm announcing that the Walker Foundation will expand its mission beyond American veterans to include collaborative projects with Vietnamese communities still experiencing Agent Orange effects. We've established partnerships with medical facilities in areas identified in my father's maps as heavily sprayed but previously unacknowledged. She detailed the three-pronged approach: medical support for affected individuals, environmental remediation of contaminated soil, and educational initiatives to ensure the full history would be preserved. The foundation would pair American medical expertise with Vietnamese implementation, creating sustainable programs rather than temporary aid. This isn't charity, Emily emphasized. It's accountability. It's completing the circle of truth my father began in his final days. From the audience, an elderly veteran raised his hand. Emily recognized Frank Gaines, who had served as a ground troop in areas her father had sprayed. "Some folks might say we don't owe anything to the other side," he said, voice gravelly from decades of smoking. "They were the enemy back then." Emily nodded, acknowledging the perspective without agreeing. The chemical didn't distinguish between combatants and civilians, between soldiers and children. The poison affected everyone, American, Vietnamese, the land itself. Healing should be equally universal. Frank considered this, then gave a single nod. "Your father was Army Air Corps?" "Air Force, yes." "And you're what? First-generation Vietnamese American?" "I was born in Vietnam, adopted by my father after my village was sprayed," Emily confirmed. Frank's weathered face creased in a smile. "That's America at its best right there, the complexity of it, the contradiction and the redemption all at once." He gestured around at the gathered veterans. "Most of us were just kids following orders. Your father found a way to make something right out of it all. Can't ask for better than that." The simple eloquence of Frank's assessment resonated through the gathering. After the formal announcements concluded, attendees broke into smaller conversations, sharing memories of Robert, discussing VA claim strategies, and offering support to those still struggling with health issues. Emily moved among them, equally comfortable discussing medical terminology with Dr. Harrison, strategic advocacy with Whitaker, or simply listening to veterans share stories of their service and subsequent battles with illness and bureaucracy. As afternoon stretched into evening, the gathering gradually thinned. Those remaining migrated to the porch and garden, where the setting sun cast long shadows across the property Robert had built as his sanctuary, and which now served as a community gathering place. Dr. Harrison approached Emily as she stood watching the sunset. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly, "not just of the foundation, but of how you've integrated both sides of your heritage." Emily smiled. "I spent my first 6 months in Vietnam and the next 45 years in America without fully acknowledging either connection. It feels right to finally embrace both." "Robert's case continues to yield important medical insights," Harrison added. 3 research papers have been published based on his tissue samples, each advancing our understanding of long-term dioxin effects. His physical suffering has become a gift to science." "He'd appreciate the irony," Emily replied, "that the poison he carried would ultimately help others." As darkness fell, only the closest members of the newly formed community remained: Whitaker and his wife, Dr. Harrison, and a few local veterans who had become regular visitors to the cabin. They gathered around the fire pit Robert had built decades ago but rarely used, sharing quiet conversation under stars that had also witnessed the distant war that connected them all. "I've been thinking about poison," Emily said during a lull in conversation. "Not just the chemical kind. "How so?" asked Whitaker, wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill that his thinning body struggled to resist. "My father carried Agent Orange in his tissues for 50 years, but he also carried secrets, guilt, unspoken truths. Both were toxic. Both ultimately surfaced." She looked into the flames. "I wonder which did more damage, the chemical or the silence?" "They're not so different," offered Harrison. "Both dioxin and trauma create cascading effects throughout systems. One physical, one psychological. Both can be passed down generationally if not addressed. Which is why breaking the silence matters as much as treating the physical effects," Whitaker added. "Your father did both in the end." As the fire burned low, Emily reflected on the dual legacy she had inherited. The biological connection to Vietnamese parents she would never know, and the complicated moral example of the American father who had saved her while participating in the system that orphaned her. The contradiction remained impossible to fully reconcile, yet somehow both truths coexisted not just peacefully but purposefully within her. The Walker Foundation would continue the work Robert had begun in his final confession, addressing both the physical poison and the toxic silence that had allowed accountability to be deferred for decades. Emily's own children would grow up understanding both their Vietnamese heritage and their complicated American legacy, embracing the full complexity of their family history rather than hiding from painful truths. In the years since Robert's passing, the black growths that had erupted from his back had become powerful symbols in veterans' advocacy, visual evidence of poison too long denied. But for Emily, the more significant emergence had been the truth itself, breaking through decades of protective silence. As the gathering concluded and Emily stood alone on the porch watching the last vehicles depart, she felt her father's presence not as a ghost, but as a continuation. His final act of truth-telling extending through her work, his redemption ongoing through the foundation bearing his name. The cabin lights glowed warmly against the darkness of the surrounding woods, no longer a fortress against the world, but a beacon drawing together those affected by a legacy of poison and silence. Robert Walker had built these walls to hide from what he had done and what he knew. Now they sheltered those seeking to expose truth and heal wounds both personal and historical. Emily looked up at the stars, the same stars that had shone over Vietnam when her birth parents lived, when Robert had flown his missions, when history had set in motion the complex chain of events that ultimately created her present. The poison had surfaced, the truth had emerged, and what remained was the ongoing work of healing, across generations, across nations, across the complicated landscapes of both body and memory. It was enough. It was everything. It was the legacy Robert Walker had finally chosen and the one Emily would carry forward. Robert Walker carried two burdens for 50 years, Agent Orange in his body and the weight of unspoken truths in his heart. Like many of our generation who served, he discovered that silence can be as toxic as chemicals, eating away at us from within. His story reminds us that it's never too late for truth, for healing, for making amends. The growths on Robert's back finally forced him to confront what he'd been hiding, both the poison and his secrets about his daughter Emily's adoption from Vietnam. In his final days, Robert chose courage over comfort, truth over silence, redemption over regret. His legacy lives on not just through the Walker Foundation helping veterans and Vietnamese victims, but in the profound lesson that healing begins when we stop carrying our burdens alone. What secrets have you kept that might bring healing if shared with loved ones? What burdens might be lighter if carried together? Our generation witnessed America's most divisive war, but we also possess the wisdom to heal those wounds through honesty, forgiveness, and connection. Share your story in the comments. What truth have you finally spoken after years of silence, and how did it change your life?